sometimes we hear people say, well, I don't want to be like that because that's boring. Well, it wasn't at all the people who were boring. These are the people who were well enough organized to get themselves, through good schools and into good jobs and into good relationships. So it turned out, the conscientious children stayed healthier and lived longer. We looked at that later in life when they were in young adulthood. They had filled out all kinds of scales in 1940. And we again went back and created new personality scales, and they were very good scales from a modern psychological approach. And then again, the trait that really predicted who was going to live the longest was this conscientiousness, this prudence, and this persistence, and this even a kind of honesty and having meaning in life.
Could it also be because the conscientious person might not have taken the kind of chances that somebody else did? For example, maybe the conscientious person driving through an intersection would slow down, but the other personality would just zoom right through, and maybe they got killed or something like that.
Well, the nice thing about the Longevity Project is we don't have to speculate. We can go back and see because we have data on them for their whole lives. So that's really why it's unique, because a lot of other studies, they'll say, well, we found this association, and we think it must be because they slow down at intersections. But we went back and we looked at what these people were doing differently, and there were a number of things. The first was, like you said, they engaged in fewer risky activities. They were less likely to smoke. They were less likely to drink to excess. They were less likely to abuse drugs, drive too fast, all those kinds of things. So that makes a lot of sense. You might say, ho-hum, so what? But there were other things that were really unexpected. So another reason for the health benefits of being really conscientious is that these people were much more likely to enter into good social relationships. So they made better friends, they had more stable marriages, and those kinds of things turned out to be health protecting. We can talk more about that later. But another aspect of this was really intriguing was that these conscientious kids, they wound up in more stable and interesting careers. So they succeeded in their careers, and they were proud of their success, and so that helped them live longer and stay healthier too. There also seems, even if you take all that into account, there seems to be also some other benefits of being conscientious, and so we think it's probably something biological that certain chemicals in the brain, probably serotonin, is relevant to being both conscientious and staying healthy. So, when you hear really simple advice, do one thing and that's the secret to health, we didn't find that at all, but we found it was complicated, but you really could understand it. So you put all those things together, and that's why the really conscientious children live longer. And it's being repeated and found again in other studies now since our initial findings came out. So it's becoming a big area of research in science in different countries around the world right now.
That's fascinating. Now, we talked about how Professor Terman didn't have a computer. You did. You were able to. How much help was that in order to analyze some of the data, having a computer?
Well, it's great. I mean, it's huge because you think about it, you have 10 million pieces of data on 1,500 people collected throughout their lives. I mean, think about it if you just collected all the data about just your own family. You take your people in your immediate family and you look at their personality when they were young and their hobbies they engaged in and the work they did and how they did in school. And, it would be really hard to keep track of all that just for your own family. But you imagine now doing that for 1,500 people over your whole life, over 8 decades. So you never could really do it. So that's one big benefit of having all this put into a computer. But we can do these statistics that we can model people's trajectories. And by that, we just mean their pathways. So some people increased on some of these things, and some people decreased, and some people increased and decreased and increased. So it's the statistics can be modeled that way. So we don't have to guess really what's happening. We can use some very sophisticated formulas, and this really couldn't even have been done 10 years ago because a lot of the statistical approaches were not really available. So it's really exciting.
And Howard, when you talk about longevity, I assume you're also talking about the quality of life because, the way I look at it, I don't want to live to be 100 if I'm going to be a wretched person who can barely move and, I've gone senile because of age or something like that. Was their quality of life pretty good too?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. First of all, we're really seeing who lives into their 70s and 80s rather than dying in their 50s and 60s and early 70s. We're not really studying who can live to 100 or 120. Very few people live at that age no matter what. So it's really who can have a normal, healthy life. But if you think about it, if you want to see which states or which countries have the best health, the public health agencies, they always look at life expectancy first, because life expectancy is the best single indicator of how healthy you are, or how healthy the state is, or the country is.
All right, let's talk about that when we come back. We're going to take this quick break. Our special guest tonight, Dr. Howard Friedman, his book along with Leslie Martin, The Longevity Project. Fascinating data. I'll be back with more. And we're with Howard Friedman, his work with Leslie Martin, The Longevity Project. Howard, we're talking about life expectancy and how we want it to be really a quality life expectancy. If we're going to live long, we're going to want to be able to function in that body of ours. What did you find with some of your work?
Well, it turns out that most people who live to old age do so not because they've beaten cancer and beaten heart disease and beaten diabetes and lung disease and so on and so on. Rather, the people who are long-lived, they mostly avoided a lot of serious ailments altogether. So if you're living a long life, it generally means you're living a healthy life. Of course, there are exceptions, but we found that a lot of the diseases tend to be predicted by the same kinds of things. So we're not trying to just prolong a life of weakness or frailty. We're trying to look at the things that make people stay healthy and thrive throughout their lives, certainly into their 70s and 80s. Again, after that, the kinds of things we're studying probably don't play much of a less role.
For example, George Burns, aside from his cigar smoking, lived way up there. I think he hit 100.
He did hit 100, yes.
Yeah.
Bob Hope as well.
Yeah. Would you say that they had similar personalities? They probably did.
Well, they certainly did in the sense that they were very persistent and well organized. So you don't stay at the top of your field for many years without really wanting to and striving and striving and striving. And that was really one of the key characteristics we found again and again. And of course, they were well organized. They couldn't be missing their dates and missing their rehearsals and generally screwing up. Those are people who kind of fall off to the wayside. Their sense of humor, that's what most people would jump to right away and say, well, they laughed a lot and they had a good sense of humor. That's why they lived the longest. We didn't find that overall. It's great to have friends and fool around and joke, but as a life approach, it just was not what people think. And in fact, both Bob Hope and George Burns, they were not in our study, but some of the famous people were. Those people, they actually had a very serious side to them as well when they were off stage.
You had the creator of the I Love Lucy show, Jess Oppenheimer.
We did. Jess Oppenheimer is one of the participants. The names of the participants are confidential for the most part, but a number of them have self-identified as being participants in the Terman study, or sometimes in their obituaries it says they were participants. And one of them was Jess Oppenheimer. He really was his idea. He worked with Lucy to create the I Love Lucy show. He was also a very smart guy in a lot of other ways. He invented one of the first kind of teleprompters that Lucy used when she was looking into the camera and reading commercials way back in the 1950s. So he wrote comedy for radio, and then he moved to writing and producing television shows. And after I Love Lucy, he worked on Get Smart. And so that was kind of typical of the people in this study. They were smart, but they went into the appealing occupations of the 20th century, and showbiz was one of those in California. But it wasn't his cheerfulness per se that led to his long life.
Have you found that people who have a longer life expectancy generally act younger? And I don't mean like a kid or a teenager, but almost like the Peter Pan syndrome, where they just, they're a little more hip, they're into things, they come alive.
Well, certainly being involved was very important. So it wasn't in a superficial kind of fooling around way necessarily, but yeah, being alive in a way that's meaningful. So people who were involved in meaningful work, people who were involved in meaningful family life, people who were involved in helping other people, those kinds of things all made a big difference. So people who just were around other people a lot, that made a big difference, rather than the more brooding loner. And if you could really groove in your work and kind of get with things, really like what you were doing, of course, that made a difference. But that wasn't the key in many cases.
Every once in a while I jump on the Internet, Howard, and I just look at the lives of people who had lived a long time ago, you know, whether they were in the 1500s or 1600s or whatever the year. Uh-huh. And you look at these remarkable people whose lives had an influence on all of us today, and some of them lived to the old age of 50, or maybe they cracked 60 in some cases. And I look at that and I go, I'm dead already if I lived during those time periods. I mean, you know, we know medicine has changed things and things like that, but why do you think the life expectancy has gone up?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because there's a real misconception out there. And, you know, the life expectancy has gone up. You know, if Americans born around 1900 could expect to live till 49, and now it's into the 70s. But it's not from adulthood, the increase. It's because of reductions in infant mortality and child mortality. So, you know, even go back even further, like you're talking about, you know, a lot of babies died, and a lot of children became sick and died, and a lot of young adults died. And so really, even quite a while ago, there were quite a few people. If you made it to 50, you know, it was pretty likely that you would live to 70. So there were quite a few people in their 70s and even 80s throughout history, but it was